Okay, welcome everybody who's joined us today for another round of our Rural and Remote Housing First uh, uh, webinar series. And today we have an exciting couple of guests to help us discuss some things related to the Indigenous perspective and how that comes into play in working in rural and remote and program specific elements. So we're excited about that, and we'll get people introduced here in a moment. Again, just wanted to remind everybody that we will be recording, or we are recording this, and we will make the recording available on the Canadian Alliance Training and Technical Assistance website under webinars. It will also be made available on the Rural and Remote website, the link to where it will be stored, and you will have access to the recording and PDF version of the slides that you see today. We are excited to be able to keep moving forward in this work and bring new awareness and enlightenment to the rural and remote housing first world. So welcome to those of you who are here. We're glad to have you, and we hope that we'll be able to provide you with some information that will be of assistance. I do want to begin with an Indigenous land acknowledgement. It's difficult when we are meeting online because there's so many of us in so many different parts of the country. And so I would actually just like to read this acknowledgement here that is kind of covers us all, I think. It says, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. And so even take a moment, I guess, to think about the specific nations that would be part of your home, where you sit and where you work today. It's definitely an important component of the work that we do, and that we hope to continue that going forward in improving our understanding of the connection that we have to First Nations, Inuit, Métis folks and their lands, and respecting that we are spending a lot of time and energy on that land trying to do great work. So with that, I'm going to actually introduce some people. I'm actually gonna skip ahead a slide and go to, I wanted to acknowledge the federal government and their role in this work, the work that we are doing in regards to this particular webinar and the things associated, which you'll hear more about later, is in part funded by the Government of Canada through the Capacity and Innovation Funding stream of Reaching Home. And we're grateful to the federal government for what they have done to help us out with that. In addition, just in terms of the agenda, so I'm going to make a couple of introductions here, and then I'm going to turn it over to our friend, Mr. French, who I will introduce, and then he can introduce our other guest, and we'll be able to move on and talk about the youth Indigenous example of Housing First and the connection to rural and remote work there. We'll hopefully, we may have some time for Q&A, and if we do, then we'll open it up and we'll try to get your voices in there. And then I'll do a quick review at the end of the Housing First toolkit, and then we'll leave it back to David to close us off. And so because I had these slides a little bit out of order, I'm going to go back and I'm going to let David French take over. But I first want to introduce David. David and I go back quite a ways, back when we both sort of worked specifically from an Alberta perspective. I was with the the city of Lethbridge, operating or providing all of the clinical support and guidance around all of the Housing First projects that were being done in the city of Lethbridge. And David worked for the provincial government in Alberta, specifically focusing a lot of his efforts around the youth work that was happening, and the importance of building programs and processes for addressing youth homelessness in our province. And David was instrumental in and a key author in writing the provincial youth plan to end homelessness. And then from there, David went on and was sort of accosted by Away Home Canada. And I don't know that they had to twist his arm a whole lot, but he was stolen to Away Home Canada and was originally head of like a lot of the policy work and things associated with Away Home Canada, and now has moved into, I think, a bit of a different role. And I'll let him maybe share a little bit more about that. But David has done a lot of great work, and we're excited to have him also as part of the Rural and Remote, the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness sort of board of governance advisory group. So I'm going to leave it to you, David, to take away, and I'll leave this slide up here for you to do what you will with.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And this webinar is not about me. It's about our partner and our colleague and our mentor from the Hamilton Regional Indian Center, Cheryl Green. And so I'll take very little time here, but I wanted to ensure that people knew that the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness is about 3 sort of key components, and that is a focus on webinars to sharing information, sort of bridging the gap between practice and policy and resources, but also sharing research and all those pieces of work that can be elevated and leveraged to, again, reinforce the importance of the rural and remote response to homelessness in general and youth homelessness, but also the gaps that exist around how this can be consideration across governments for prioritization, knowing that, you know, while homelessness is distinct and unique for individuals, it's also distinct and unique for rural and remote communities. And so before I introduce Cheryl, I think it's a good opportunity to maybe give you a high level understanding of why we get to work with Cheryl. And we get to work with Cheryl because the Hamilton Regional Indian Center is part of the Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Demonstration Lab, which is a multi-year collaborative project that is working towards testing approaches to support prevention to facilitate sustained exits from homelessness. And so as part of this phase that we're in, there are interventions across 12 sites in Canada. And we've had the goal of reaching 1,300 young people and providing the best possible outcomes for young people and their families, while also facilitating the research, the evaluation, and the content or practice elements that are necessary to think about how we would accelerate interventions across this prevention continuum across Canada. And so really what we're building towards is not only a really sort of elevated shift towards youth homelessness prevention, but it's an opportunity to think differently about what this means for specific and targeted communities. And so that's where Cheryl comes in. And Cheryl's provided me with a bio, and if I might, because it is magic, I want to read it. And I think it's important that sort of we ground ourselves in this work on a number of different levels. And that's certainly what Cheryl has brought to our work, is she's grounded us in many ways. And so Cheryl is a member of the Oneida Bear Clan from Six Nations, but is now calling Hamilton home. And she is the mother of 2 adult sons and 2 wonderful grandbabies. Having lived in Six Nations lands before moving to Hamilton with her grandmother 41 years ago, she does frequently visit. And her journey across social services didn't begin until 2008, actually, where she was working with the Indigenous community, and she's been working with the Indigenous community ever since. And most of her experience has been frontline with at-risk youth. However, Recently, she's expanded her skills in the management level, overseeing a variety of programs through HRIC and focusing on housing and homelessness needs for all ages. And so her goal really is to provide equitable access to housing stock and to develop partnerships to increase unit availability with a focus on getting our young people housed and supporting them to maintain and stabilize their housing. And they've very much done that through their program. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it. She believes housing is a human right. And we are all here to ensure that it's happening and not leaving our brothers and sisters out in the cold. Everyone deserves a safe place to call home. So with that, I will go off camera and I'll hand it over to Cheryl. Wally, you'll change the sharing settings?
It's ready for her to share.
Excellent. You're off to the races, Cheryl.
Thank you so much, David and Wally, for having me join everyone, I'm guessing, because I only see David and Wally on my screen. So I'm thinking that there's more people out there. So I first want to just apologize. I'm in the process of moving offices and I'm sharing with someone who's in the midst of moving out. So if someone does pop in behind me, I apologize for that. So I think we'll get started. I do have a PowerPoint that I am going to share. Okay, and I hope everybody can see that okay.
You bet.
All right, perfect. So I'm not sure if people ask questions as we go through or if that'll be at the end, but David or Wally, if you can give me a heads up if I need to stop talking at any time.
We've left time on the agenda for questions at the end, so you can just roll through it. Thank you.
Go through. Okay, awesome. Okay. So I did put some content in this first slide in terms of the relationship between HRIC, Away Home, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and just, you know, kind of how we came together under making the shift. And, you know, really being able to establish a housing first for youth project that really aligned with the specific needs of Indigenous young people. So conversations had started some time ago, you know, and we've been able to progress ever since. And so with that progression, we also created a partnership with Wakabiness Bryce in order to be able to help inform and guide some of that research piece that goes with making the shift. As we all know, when we're looking at projects, there does need to be, you know, research to show, you know, success, as well as, you know, challenges and where things need to, or things could be improved and things like that. So Wakabiness Bryce has been a huge asset in terms of providing some of that content. So there's 3 demonstration sites in Ontario, Ottawa, Toronto, and of course us here in Hamilton. So I'm going to assume that many of you already know what Housing First is. But in case you don't, you know, it's really about being able to support community members or those who are in need, and in this case, our young people, to get them housed, right? That with no preconditions, get them off the street, couch surfing from shelter, whatever their current situation is, move them quickly into safe housing, and, you know, then be able to work with them on some of those other challenges that they have. You know, one of my things is, you know, how can a young person focus on their education when they're worried about where they're going to rest their head that night? And so when we look at Housing First, it addresses that, right? We look at, you know, getting them stabilized and then looking at all of those other things that can help support them with their sustainability and moving forward on their transition into adulthood. There's 5 core principles with Housing First, and I probably don't have the most current cover of the framework on here, but we'll go with this for now. And so there's 5 core principles of Housing First. And, you know, just making sure that, you know, we are addressing and aligning, you know, our project with the 5 core principles. So, and again, you know, that there's permanent housing and no requirement for readiness. There are programs, you know, around that do require their clients to, you know, maybe have ID or have income, or, you know, abstain from substances, you know, those types of things. So we don't hold any of those readiness requirements. And youth choice and self-determination, right? The youth are so used to being told what to do that their options are limited. And so, you know, with our staff and, you know, the requirement of Housing First for Youth, you know, it's important to ensure that the youth have that platform to share their ideas and to voice their concerns. Ultimately, you know, there's no buy-in from the youth if they don't have an opportunity to have any sort of input. Positive youth development orientation, right? So, you know, making sure that the youth are being able to move forward through the process, right? That ultimately when they become adults, you know, that the whole goal is to reduce, in my opinion, is to reduce the number of homeless Indigenous adults that we have. And if you know, are able to work with young people and provide the skills necessary, it will help prepare them for that, which goes into the individualized and client-driven supports. Every youth is different. There is no one size fits all. You know, especially when we're looking at Indigenous youth, they have different levels of engagement in their culture, different levels of knowledge about their culture and where they come from. So we have to focus on those supports being individualized for that particular young person. And then social and community integration. So when we look at that, you know, when we look at Indigenous people as a whole, you know, it's really important to have that support from your community. And many of our young people, you know, don't really know what's available in their community, don't know how to get involved, or relying on their community for those supports. So it's really important that we're looking at that piece, especially when we're working with Indigenous young people, just to be able to enhance their opportunity and their resources for community integration and connection. So housing options. So again, you know, Housing First for Youth looks at 4 different options, you know, to, you know, address the youth's needs. And, you know, and again, it all depends on the youth, where they're at and what they're looking for. You know, some youth, you know, are okay with returning home. Some are not. Some like to be in a room rental or a congregate living environment because they like to have those folks around them. And then there's some that absolutely do not want to have roommates, that they want their independence. So again, this is up to the young person as to what their own needs are and where they're comfortable and what they're, you know, where they want to be. So we take all of that into consideration. There are preconditions for entry, right? So like I had said previously, there's no requirements of coming into the program. Even if a young person in Ontario, we have Ontario Works, which is a social assistance program. So even if a young person has no income and does require going on to Ontario Works, we would still support them, help them with, you know, last month's rent, first month's rent, whatever it is that they need to help get them housed, and support them with applying and moving forward with the Ontario Works process, right? So we want to make sure that they are not being not being housed because of income, as an example. And then, you know, there's zero discharge to homelessness. So, you know, I'm sure that many of you that are here have had some of those challenging clients. You know, maybe they didn't pay their rent. You know, there's having issues in the home. But we do not discharge into homelessness. It does not mean that youth have not lost their housing. It does mean that even if they do lose their housing, our navigators are still there to support them with, you know, creating another environment where they can be safe. So what is Endaayaang? So Endaayaang is actually an Ojibwe word meaning a safe place where your heart or spirit feels at home. And so back when we were, you know, trying to come up with a name, we had went to a knowledge keeper in the community and basically shared, you know, what are our goals? What is the focus of what we're trying to do here with our youth? You know, we talked about creating a home. We talked about, you know, having a safe space. We spoke about, you know, the challenges that youth could be experiencing. We shared, you know, what are our goals in this project in terms of supporting our young people. And, you know, and this name came from that. So it's important that if you are looking at creating or have a program or project that supports Indigenous people, whether it's youth, adults, families, that, you know, things align with Indigenous culture. So we were very lucky that we were gifted this name and were able to move forward with calling our project Endaayaang, because it really does create an opportunity for our young people to have that safe space. Just looking here. So one of the other things is really looking at having in that culture part of our day-to-day. Many of our young people have not had an opportunity to be exposed to their culture, or, you know, maybe at a young age they did and then they lost contact with their home community. So it's about that reintegration, but really it's about providing access to culture in a means that will help support our young people heal and move forward on their journey. And, you know, we do that by ensuring that our young people have access to traditional teachings. So we do bring in elders and knowledge keepers. We have 2 journey coaches who do all of our programming. And our programming is specifically geared and aligned to our medicine wheel and our case management model, which I will go over in a few slides. And then we have our housing navigators. So, you know, having those tools readily available for our young people. So in terms of smudging, you know, when our young people move into their apartment, we provide a smudge kit. We give them a keychain to put their keys on for their first apartment, or, you know, whatever their case may be. And we do have an emergency on-call number. So that number is engraved onto their keychain. So those are just some of the things that the navigators do with them, you know, to be able to focus on culture. And we integrated the culture into our day-to-day as well. So as I move forward through our presentation, you'll be able to get a glimpse of that as well. So as I mentioned, you know, like our youth are at different stages when they come into the program. So we could have a young person who comes in who is exiting child welfare, so leaving a foster home. We could have a young person come into the program who, you know, maybe wants to live with auntie or uncle, and, you know, the family are having some challenges with, you know, food and keeping upkeep of the bills, right? So, you know, they come into the program in a variety of situations. So it's up to us to, you know, make sure that our youth have the tools and skills necessary to not only obtain housing, but how do they maintain and or stabilize that housing, right? Because we can get people housed, but if, you know, we're not working with them on a consistent basis to maintain that housing, ultimately they could find themselves in positions where they're at risk of losing that housing again. So it's really important that, you know, our staff are continuously supporting our young people to try and mitigate or alleviate those things from happening. We do provide programming to our participants. We do encourage them to participate. However, again, because there is no preconditions in Housing First, we don't make our programming mandatory. We do try to make it fun. We make it informative, as well as, you know, offer incentive, because, you know, we all know that youth like to come out if there's food, if there's gift cards, things like that. So we make sure that we try to include those types of things. And just really being able to build those relationships. When we're working with Indigenous people, myself included, you know, sometimes formulating relationships of trust can be a bit challenging, right? So we take our time to get to know the youth. We share all the information about the project so that they are well informed as to what their requirements are of being in the project. But we do serve self-identified Indigenous youth between 16 and 24. And what that means is, as long as a young person identifies as having Indigenous ancestry, then they would be eligible to receive service. Because some of the youth that we do work with do come from child welfare, some are not aware of where their home community is, or even, you know, like their band name, things like that. So as long as, you know, they say that, you know, I've been told this, or I've been shared this, and I want to learn more, then absolutely they can complete an intake and see where we can go from there. So they do not require to have status being in Endaayaang. And so our caseload right now, we can support up to about 30 young people, which means there's an average caseload of 6 to 8 participants with each navigator. But again, that depends on staffing, right? Right now we are a little short staffed, so there are some navigators that are working with additional young people, just to make sure that those services are continued even with the gap in staffing right now. So, and as I mentioned, you know, I mentioned child welfare. So our participants do need to identify as being homeless, at risk of homelessness, and exiting one of these systems. So justice, healthcare, child welfare, or if there is safety or violence happening in the home or their current living environment. So with our young people, it is gone over with them at the intake process that they will meet with their navigator once a week at a minimum. However, the navigators are available to meet with youth more frequently should they need it, and it is on an individual basis. You know, we support the young people with, you know, connection with their landlord, how to pay their rent, and really look at identifying what the needs are of the young person. You know, do they need ID? You know, what are those specific life skills that they need to work on? You know, are we looking at connecting them with family and natural supports? Are they wanting to go back to school, get a job, you know, all of those types of things. So the navigators do all of that work with them. And we do unit checks, right, to make sure that they are maintaining their unit and that there's no challenges there that we could foresee and help support them through to, again, reduce the possibility of losing their housing. And then also identifying goals, right? So we want to make sure that we're working on, you know, what the goals are of the young person, what have they identified, and how do we support them with, you know, completing that goal, and what do they need to do to reach that goal as well. So they do need to have a social insurance number. They do need to participate in research with the project, and that can be with our story catcher, and I'll go into the research component a little bit later as well, or completing the Making the Shift survey. We do provide rent supplements, and the idea would be that as we're working with the young person to stabilize their housing, that, you know, we could look at decreasing the rent supplement, and they would increase their portion of the rent to help get them to a point where they're sustaining their own rental cost. Because ideally, you know, we want to make sure that we're not setting them up for failure, that they are going to be able to manage and still be able to pay their rent without the rent supplement. So those are some of the things that our navigators do to support our young people in terms of being able to move forward. So this is a little timeline that Steve actually created for a different presentation that I have borrowed and added some pieces to it. And it really gives you a timeline of Endaayaang and, you know, where we started and where we are today. So, you know, the project initially started in April of 2017. It took us a little bit of time to really get things going. And, you know, we took some time. We went and met some folks in Calgary and Edmonton. We did our research. So when I say we, there was my coworker, Shannon Murphy, and myself who, you know, really wanted to make sure that we were creating Endaayaang from a cultural perspective and making sure that we did that groundwork to ensure that we were doing this work in a good way, and that we had input from our elders, knowledge keepers, and the people who know more than I do, our young people. So we did a cultural competency training in Toronto to a variety of Making the Shift staff. We did a woods edge ceremony, and basically we all came together. So there was young people. We had a young person as our fire keeper. We had various staff from COH and Away Home, and we had grandmother Renee. So we were all up bright and early and out at the fire and did a sunrise ceremony to offer our tobacco and, you know, really be able to come together and do this work from a good mind, a good space, and really look at what our goals were and how could we align them all together to be successful. So the partnership with Waakabanas Bryce started in February 2018. We had a youth visioning session in May of 2018 in order to get the youth's feedback about what they were looking for in Endaayaang. In October 2018, we met with Home Fire and Away Home. 2019 in January, we hosted an elder and knowledge keeper and youth gathering. So we had approximately 8 elders and knowledge keepers, which was an amazing turnout. And I think it was about 17 or 18 young people who all gathered over a weekend. We started on a Friday night, you know, with some games and some food, and we're able to bring our elders and knowledge keepers and our youth together. And then we also did sessions all day Saturday and all day Sunday, where we presented our case management model, you know, gave information about Housing First for Youth, and really were able to get some input from our young people and those who have the knowledge of what they feel would be beneficial to them. So we officially launched Endaayaang in February of 2019, which is when we began our intakes of clients. And from that point, from February 2019, we have supported, almost 40 young people, and we currently have 27 in our program right now. We had a youth logo design in March. That was great, and the logo was on the front cover of my slide presentation. And then in January of 2020, I was able to develop a partnership with City Housing Hamilton, which has been a great opportunity for 10 young people. And we were able to access 10 units from City Housing Hamilton, where we have been able to house our youth. And so when they did the visioning session, this was the outcome. So it was another way for youth to be able to share their ideas, what's important to them, and you know, have staff really hear what they're saying and what they want in the programming, in the project development, and so on. And so, you know, we look at the scattered site option in terms of, you know, what we do to try and support our young people to secure their housing, right? So as I had mentioned, it could be, you know, in their own house, apartment, you know, it could be with a family member, but it's really about trying to support our young people, build strong and positive relationships with their landlord, as well as their community, right, with their neighbors. We have access to a landlord liaison here at HRIC that has been hugely beneficial in terms of increasing access to housing stock. And we also make sure that we support our young people within the first 30 days that they come into the project to complete various housing applications. So here in Hamilton, we have access to housing, which is a very long wait list to get into any sort of subsidized or geared to income housing. And so we make sure that we do that first off so that they can get on that list. They need to be on the access to housing list in order to apply to Sacagawea, which is another nonprofit housing organization here in Hamilton that's specific to Indigenous people. And then we also support them with an application to Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services in order to increase their opportunity to access various housing. So as I mentioned, we have our partnership with City Housing Hamilton, and we do have 2 locations. So it's at 95 Hess and 181 Jackson. The City Housing Hamilton department call these 2 buildings Vanier Towers. So we have 10, like I had mentioned, 10 units in combination between the 2 buildings. There's 2 1-bedrooms, and then there are 8 bachelor units. So we do have program space in the basement of 95 Hess Street, which we received a donation from the councillors of Hamilton in order to create in order to complete the renovations in this space. So I've included a few photos here on the bottom. Hopefully you can see them. So with COVID, we've got the barriers at our desks. And, you know, we do have 3 rooms that we use for our programming. And so the picture on the right is our kind of like living room area hangout space. And if you can see on the right of the photo, the right side of the room is lined with cedar. It's really important for me to make sure that we included various medicines in the space. So we have cedar on the walls. We do provide access to sage and sweetgrass for smudging, as well as tobacco ties. So if the youth need to access that and take them out and offer tobacco, they have all of those medicines are readily available to them. And this is the space where our journey coaches do our programming. Now this is pre-COVID times. We're not doing programming in the evenings or on the weekends right now because of COVID, but typically our journey coaches do provide programming in the evening and on weekends to make sure that they are able to, you know, connect with youth, and that the youth have as much access to the programming as possible. We do have youth who are in class during the day, some of them are working. We want to make sure that, you know, that the supports that are available to them are accessible. And so the Journey coaches, when they do their programming, they provide cultural supports focusing on the spiritual, physical, emotional, mental needs of the young people, as well as traditional and non-traditional life skills. So when I think of traditional life skills, it's a little bit opposite from Indigenous tradition, because those traditional life skills that when you go to services, you know, they want to teach you cooking, cleaning, budgeting, which are great, and we definitely do incorporate those in our programming. But the non-traditional life skills of the mainstream environment are the traditional life skills of Indigenous people, so the roles and responsibilities, healthy relationships, things like that. So we look at all of that and we incorporate those in all of our programming as well. So, you know, there's no time limit with youth being in Endaayaang or a Housing First for Youth project. You know, the goal is to help them, you know, learn the skills, get that knowledge, and kind of move through the project so that they can be successful adults. So there really is no time limit to say, you know, when they can, how long they're going to be in the program. The reality is that, you know, I would not want to see a young person come in at 16 and stay until they're 24, because I feel like, okay, what are the challenges there? What are the barriers, right? Why are they not moving forward, right? So, you know, I definitely would look at that in terms of, you know, what is happening or what are the challenges that this young person is facing that may be prohibiting them from moving forward and moving on beyond our program. And that the youth that age out, you know, we do connect them to adult services, whether it's here at HRIC or other agencies out in the community. One of the great things that we do have in agreement with City Housing Hamilton, so our units that are at Vanier Towers, if a young person ages out of Endaayaang and is in one of those units, if they complete the market application with City Housing, they do have the possibility of staying in their unit, and Endaayaang would receive an additional unit for someone in the program. So, you know, if they're in one of those units, they wouldn't be at risk of losing their housing and have to move out unless they didn't meet the requirements of the market rent application, which is fairly straightforward. So when working with our Indigenous youth, you know, they face a variety of challenges. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if everyone can hear. They're moving offices next door, so I can hear them. I'm hoping that it's not distracting to you and that you can hear the movement as well. But just let me know if things get too loud here.
You're good, Cheryl. Okay,
great. So some of the challenges that our young people could be facing is, you know, family relationships. That family breakdown is very common with our young people. So we really try to rely on that family and natural supports training that is provided to us. Really focus on that reconnection to family or those other supports that they have in the community, right? Because we want to support our young people with being self-sufficient, right? Because this project isn't going to be here forever, as much as I would like for it to be. You know, we need to make sure that we're supporting our young people to utilize those resources and stuff in the community. There's intergenerational cultural and historical trauma, which many of us are aware of due to colonization and residential school and the impacts that has had on Indigenous people. So, you know, the loss of identity, connection to community, which are why those things are very important to me, and that we include those in our project development. And so, you know, we can address some of these challenges by creating positive relationships with our youth, and try to bring them out of, you know, that isolation phase that they're in, which is really different from COVID right now. Because as an Indigenous person working with Indigenous people, we're always, you know, get out, get involved in your community, socialize. And then COVID happened and we're saying, no, stay home, don't socialize, do not connect with your community. So I feel like, you know, COVID has really put a damper on our plans in terms of, you know, trying to support our young people with building on those relationships. And it's kind of halted things in a way that nobody could foresee or prepare for. But, you know, we're doing the best we can, and we have switched to doing all of our stuff virtual. So just kind of add that in there. And it's really about working with those that have been affected by trauma. And it's more times than not, you know, that our young people have experienced trauma. And when I move on to a few of our other slides, I'll talk about our case management model. But when we look at the circle of courage, and we use that quite often, it's really about looking at that trauma, and that trauma, how it impacts a person's spirit, right? And so if a young person has experienced multiple traumas, it affects their spirit in terms of, you know, it being broken or having a distorted spirit. And our goals are to help support that young person to address that trauma, mend their broken spirit, and, you know, be able to move forward on that journey to wellness. So we do multiple things. So some of them are listed there on the screen. And so, as I had mentioned, you know, we went and met, you know, different agencies to provide some input. We, you know, met with our young people. We held gatherings, and it just really was a way to be able to begin this work in a good way. And so, as I mentioned, the case management model, so it was created through guidance and feedback from the elders and the youth. And it was presented, you know, like I shared with Kim Kakakwe, and I'm from Calgary, or she lives in Calgary. And originally, you know, I was like, okay, you know, how do we align the Housing First core principles with the circle of courage? Because although we want to make sure that we are aligning the work that we're doing and meeting the needs of, you know, the funder in terms of focusing on the core principles, you know, how could we do this from a cultural perspective? And like I had mentioned in the beginning, it was really about how do we align things? How do we incorporate culture in the work that we do, but also staying true in terms of the original design of Housing First for Youth. And so Kim, you know, was able to support and provide some ideas and context on how we can move forward with this. And, you know, it's been a great resource for us so far. And, you know, being able to learn myself, the staff as learning as well. So the Circle of Courage came from a book, and it's Reclaiming Youth at Risk. And it was written by Larry Brentro and Martin Brokenleg. And it really goes through, you know, the spirit of our young people, you know, working with at-risk youth. And how do we turn that broken or distorted spirit into a mended and healthy one? And so it has helped guide a lot of the work that we do. And ultimately, you know, with my new position of overseeing our housing and homelessness department, all of my staff now read Youth at Risk, even if they don't work with youth. Because the way that I look at it is our adults who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless also have their own traumas, also have their own broken spirit. And although the book is specifically about young people, at some point we need to work with them to heal that trauma and that brokenness that they feel so that they can be successful. So it has been a great tool, and it has expanded across my entire department in order to be able to support our clients. So we also use this as a means for our programming as well as our goal setting. This gives you an idea of what our case management model looks like. I do have one here, so if you can see it, you know, it's just printed on paper, it's been laminated, and I've got a little peg in the back so that it can be movable, right? Because one of the things that we need to realize that although we have it set up this way, that you come into the project in the spirit of belonging, you know, everything is interchangeable, right? The quadrants in the medicine wheel, when you look at the 7 grandfather teachings as a means of a way to live a balanced lifestyle, they come in at different times of our lives. And we use this tool as a teaching or learning opportunity in terms of being able to take those real life experiences and turn them into one of these areas. 1 minute? Okay. I'll talk really quick. I think I've got a few more slides to get through. Yeah. So the things on the circles on the outside, the health and well-being, education, employment, complementary supports, and so on, are all the outcomes that need to be achieved through Housing First. And in my opinion, we tie all of those together by creating a sense of community. So when we do our programming, our goal is to allow our young people to obtain those outcomes. And this is our medicine wheel that we use. I've incorporated the 7 grandfather teachings, the circle of courage, the seasons. So if you have an understanding of the medicine wheel, it has 4 quadrants, and each of those quadrants represent a multitude of things. And from my understanding, it can take about 10 days to have the teaching of the medicine wheel and go through everything. And we don't have 10 days, I have less than 1 minute. So we're gonna have to move on to the next slide. The research portion. So we have been lucky. We have a research assistant who is dedicated to supporting Endaayaang staff, community partners, and our young people. And we call this person a story catcher because it's really about having them understand, hear, and share the stories of our young people and their journey. And it's not about, you know, a checkbox. It's not about, has the youth engaged in education, yes or no? For us, it's about that journey to get to that point to check that box, right? You know, just because our youth may not have gone to school and focused on their education, they might have got a library card, might be going to the library and checking out books. They might be engaging in our book club, right? So when you have a checkbox, there's no room to put the success of that young person in that box. So it's really important to have our journey catcher who can share all of that information. As I mentioned, we have 27 participants. Right now we have 4 out of our 5 navigators. We have 2 journey coaches. We work under the Housing and Homelessness Supports and Services Department, which I am the manager. We allow access and encourage access to our elders and knowledge keepers for our young people and our staff. And we are actually moving towards a mobile street outreach team where one of those staff are dedicated to supporting youth who are homeless. These are our other programs and services that are in the Housing and Homelessness Supports and Services Department that I oversee. There you go. How did I do? Did I go over a minute?
You did great. Great. I know we only, for those of you who are still with us on the webinar, I know we only have scheduled until noon, so perhaps, Wally or Terry Lee, if you're there, if people do have questions, are people able to stay on a bit longer? I unfortunately have to leave, but if there are questions, can one of you stay to help facilitate those?
Yeah, I'm good to hang out for a few minutes anyway, for sure.
Okay, perfect. Before I leave, I just wanted to, I'll place it in the chat as well, but if you have any specific questions about the Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Demonstration Lab, do reach out to me. My email is now in the chat. You can reach me there, or Wally or Terry, you know how to get at me, so you can find me through them as well. But thank you for attending, and I look forward to the questions. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks.
Thanks, David. So Cheryl, I really appreciate all that information and the time you took to help us kind of understand what's going on with Endaayaang and those kinds of things. And I just had an initial question, and I don't know if other people have any at the moment. It doesn't look like it yet, but they may be waiting. But my initial question for you was, again, because we're sort of focusing on the rural and remote aspect of things, if you had to sort of summarize in a minute or less how the work you do translates to maybe an Indigenous organization that's working in a very remote area, what do you think would be the key elements that they should focus on and think about and that stand out for you?
I would say, one, creating relationships with your housing providers that are in that community, making sure that they are holding their city or town accountable to end homelessness and create accessibility to housing, as well as, I would say, transportation. Right? Because a lot of our learnings for our young people happen in programming. And as much as I think it's great for a staff to go to a youth suite or apartment to help teach them some of those skills, they also need to have that opportunity to integrate and connect with their peers who have had the same or similar experiences. And so in those rural communities, transportation can be a huge barrier and challenge for them to get out. So I would say those, because I mean, if you don't have appropriate or those supports in place for the housing, where are you going to house your clients, right? So those are probably the two major areas that I would say need to be focused on.
And so a lot of people struggle with, well, how can we do housing first? Because the common comment is, well, we don't have any housing. And so people say, well, how do we do housing first when there is no housing? And so we often try to talk about how housing first isn't really just about the housing, although housing is an important component. But what would you say to somebody if they were going to say, we struggle with implementing housing first because we don't have housing?
You could still be working on all of those tools and knowledge so that when they do get housed, they're readily prepared. But I would say get creative, right? You need to be, as much as, I would say right now in Hamilton, there's no housing, but we need to be creative in terms of how do you look at that? Can somebody stay with a family member? Can we help support and offset some of those costs for auntie or uncle or whoever it is that they're with, right? It's about building relationships and partnerships with those who do have the housing, right? So I think that sometimes it's thinking outside the box and being somewhat creative. In the early stages of Endaayaang, we had a congregate living environment. We rented a home and housed 4 youth, in that home and provided programming there that was their space. So, that wasn't something that, we originally set out to do. But the reality is that we had young people who were homeless, and we needed to think outside the box and find a way to help get them housed.
Yeah. Yeah. We often talk about that Housing First is actually not a housing program, but that it is a recovery program where housing, is one of the key elements that's going to help people actually recover in a greater level. And so when you talk about, the medicine wheel and from the Indigenous perspective, what recovery actually means, right? And that whole balanced perspective of wellness and everything else, that's really what Housing First is talking about when it talks about recovery. And so I think it's just really important for people to understand that housing may be an important component, but if it's not there for whatever reason, there are so many other aspects of an individual's life that can be addressed and worked on, and they don't have to necessarily do nothing until they get into housing. But yet we know, like as you highlighted in the very beginning of your presentation, that housing is kind of a foundational thing in a lot of ways. It's hard to make a lot of things happen if you don't have safety, if you don't have, a place where you can feel like you can move forward from. But so yeah, I think that those are important things that you mentioned, that there's different things that you can address and talk about. And then the creativity in housing. I think that's another challenge that people often forget about, is that, well, we can't do Housing First unless there's housing. But part of your job, if you're going to do Housing First, is to actually help to create those housing opportunities, which is why it's different than most other programs out there.
Yeah, and I think that, focusing on that balance is really important, whether they have housing or not. Having that understanding of how not having balance in their lives throws things off. A lot of times I use the example of a car, and I could be, saying these parts of a vehicle completely wrong. But, if you have a tie rod, as an example, that is broken, your front right wheel might be a little shaky. And if you continue to drive your car like that, it could cause problems for your ball joint and your alignment and all of these things, right? So it's the same with our balance and wellness. If you are not focusing on your mental, physical, and emotional, spiritual needs as a whole, your self is off kilter, and it could create further issues in other areas if you're not balanced. Just like a car, right? You might need new tires, and it can create more challenges for you. So we can work on the wellness and the balance piece, whether someone is housed or not housed. So, we look at that as an individual basis and go from there.
Yeah. There's a comment in the chat from Alin, who says, it's hard to heal when you're living in survival mode. And that's exactly what I was thinking about, is that's where the housing piece becomes important, right? Is it helps people to get to that place where they feel safe enough to address other things. So what are some ways that you in your program, and especially from an Indigenous cultural perspective, have helped these young people, even if they're still living on the street or kind of functioning in that survival mode, help them to feel safe enough to maybe even take a look at or work on some of these other areas to create better balance?
Creating that rapport, right? Building a relationship, focusing on the community as a whole, right? Because when they are in survival mode, as someone had mentioned, it's like the be all and end all of getting what I need to fulfill my survival for the moment, right? But when it goes beyond that in terms of when I'm ready or when I need or when I'm in this situation, who am I going to reach out to, right? And the goal is to build that relationship with our young people so that when they get in those situations, when they are ready, when they are in need, when they need to run something by somebody, that they have that person that they can go to, right? Mm-hmm. Trust is a big issue, right, for Indigenous people in all aspects. So whether it's an organization, whether it's the government, whether it's a landlord, whatever it is, trust is a huge issue. Mm-hmm. So you need to build on that and create a good, strong, positive relationship so that those young people know that they have someone to go to, right? As I mentioned, so like some of them are involved with child welfare, the justice system. You know, they've been passed around, here, this worker, that worker, go here, do that. And it's disheartening, it's discouraging. And so when we are there to be able to support them through those challenges, it does build on the relationship. It does formulate a good rapport. And so that they do know that they can reach out when they need something, right? And to me, that would be the foundation, is getting to know that young person.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. So we're you know, our attendees are starting to dwindle away. They've obviously got other meetings and things, and so we understand, but the recording is going to be there, so this information people will catch later. I want to sort of just thank you again for sharing all of that information. I'm going to just quickly, to kind of close things off, share my screen again quickly and go over a final slide or two. I'm not sure how that's going that direction, but I just wanted to highlight again for people, I'm not going to go into all of this, but this is kind of where a lot of this stemmed from, is that we're working on this Rural and Remote Housing First Toolkit, which is going to be an addendum to the existing Canadian Housing First Toolkit. These are some points that we're focusing on with that toolkit, and that should be some of the outcomes and deliverables related to that. One of the things that we are still working towards is getting people who are involved in delivering or wanting to deliver rural and remote housing first programs to participate with us in a pre and post version of doing a housing first fidelity assessment. Because as you see, one of the deliverables is going to be a rural and remote specific housing first fidelity checklist. And so if there's programs out there that are open to doing that, then please let me know, and so that we can get you involved and continue to gather that information. But our deadline for having this all complete is the end of March. So we want to move forward quickly. Otherwise, I don't know, Terry Lee, if you have any closing comments. If you do, feel free to chime in, but otherwise, you know, we have Terry Lee Kelford and Shane Peltier, who are the co-chairs of the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness. And we encourage you to reach out to them at any time to ask questions. You received David's contact information, and I think Cheryl had her contact information up there. So feel free to reach out to any of us at any time for more information. But otherwise, thanks a ton for joining us. And again, this recording, and Cheryl, if you're okay, I would love for you to fire me off a PDF version, or you can send them PowerPoint if you like, but a PDF version works, because we're just going to turn it into PDF anyway, and of the slides, and include that with the recording so that people can snag that later on. But otherwise, folks, have a great day and enjoy the rest of it, and hope everybody has a great holiday season, as that's coming up upon us quickly. So take care and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Wally. You too.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. Bye-bye.